Hi, everyone. This is Camille Catlett. I'm joining you today from Carborough, North Carolina, and it will be my privilege and pleasure to share information with you about a new tool that has been under development for a while in Pennsylvania that I hope you will find interesting and useful in increasing the quality of the courses that you teach or know others who teach. I'm going to check and make sure that everybody can access the chat box by asking you to take a minute, and in the chat box, please, if you would be kind enough to offer from what part of Pennsylvania are you joining us today. If you would let us see the chat box answers that show us how many different portions of the Commonwealth are represented. While you're doing that, I want to mention that there are 4 handouts that were developed for today's webinar. One of them is the rubric itself. Second, there's a brief guide to using the rubric, and as part of that guide, there is a sample course syllabus, so you can actually practice using the rubric. Then there is a handout for today with additional information about some of the resources that I'll be mentioning. And also there will be the PowerPoints from this webinar. As was mentioned, this is a recording for the first 30 minutes of our time together. I'm going to be sharing information with you about the rubric, how it came to be, and some ideas about how it might be used. Then at 1:30, I will stop or restart my video and we'll have a chance to have a conversation. So I would ask that you hold any questions because we'd like this to be a webinar that just talks about the basics of the rubric that you can then share with others, and others who can't join today will be able to use. So one of the reasons for creating the rubric is that there has been significant change in our field of, I will use the term the early childhood field broadly to include both early childhood and early childhood special education and early intervention. There have been a number of publications, efforts, resources, frameworks. Most recent of those that you see on the screen came out this year, the new version of developmentally appropriate practice. And what they have helped us to really pay attention to is how much more explicitly and intentionally we need to incorporate an emphasis on children who are unique in many ways and their families, and to provide opportunities for students who are participating in higher education to not only learn about those differences, but to have opportunity to practice and become skilled at interacting with and supporting children and families who are very diverse. To give you an idea, I pulled a couple quotes. This happens to be a quote from the 2020 version of developmentally appropriate practice, reminding us of the importance of supporting educators to reflect on and address their own inherent biases and to help them provide developmentally, culturally, and linguistically responsive learning experiences to an increasingly diverse population of children. This is not exclusively true that there is increased emphasis on individualizing in national frameworks, but it's also very much a feature of state frameworks in Pennsylvania. I hope that many of you are familiar with Pennsylvania's gorgeous family engagement framework and how much it reminds us, and this is a direct quote from page 7, of the complex intersections of race, socioeconomic status, gender, religion, ethnicity, disability, and language, and how all of those need to be taken into account as we work to grow early childhood professionals who can facilitate engagement. Then also pulling from your another state framework, just the message that candidates must use their content knowledge that is rooted in child development, including age, individual, and cultural appropriateness. So with many frameworks really advocating for and encouraging more explicit emphasis, Pennsylvania really has been paying attention to how important it is to prepare future professionals to support each and every child. And so came up with the idea that it might be helpful to develop a rubric that could really help to examine syllabi with an eye toward opportunities to make those courses more reflective of and responsive to those national, state, and also federal guidelines. So let me just tell you a little bit about the rubric. And again, let me remind you, for those of you who are not familiar with the frameworks that I just mentioned, the handout that you have, the one-page handout, has links to more information about each of those. So the rubric is a tool, and it's a tool that can guide the review and documentation of content and also of areas of practice that are explicit and documentable in a course syllabus. So a difference between the rubric and what an instructor might think of as what they're teaching is that the rubric will really only respond to what is explicit in a course syllabus. And we know that each of you includes more information about individualizing than what is included in the syllabus. But I think a first starting point for really looking at the extent to which students are being prepared to support each and every child can be to examine the words that are in the syllabus. Provides a snapshot of the depth and breadth to which specific indicators are present. It shows the extent to which those indicators are incorporated in documentable course expectations like assignments. And it may be used in a pre-post fashion to document changes. One of the other things that I think it might be important to consider is, why would you even think about using a rubric? And one reason might be that you want to really make sure that you're clearly conveying to your students the vocabulary, knowledge, skills, practices, and dispositions that are important in a specific course. Early childhood is a language, so is early childhood special education. This is part of really making sure your students speak that language fluidly. It's also to support consistency. So when a faculty member who has taught a course forever possibly retires and someone new steps in, that the emphasis that had been so important will be maintained. To reflect alignment with and commitment to a variety of frameworks, as I mentioned. And also, this is probably a selfish reason, but to make it easier for accreditors to review syllabi favorably, whether that's for regional accreditation or for national accreditation. So what I wanted to share is how the Pennsylvania rubric came to be. And we examined state frameworks, we examined national frameworks, and we examined federal frameworks, those being the frameworks that really apply to, for example, children with disabilities. And looking at these, looked for common areas of emphasis across the frameworks and came up with 20 indicators that you see listed on this sheet. They're also listed on your copy of the rubric, which I'm guessing you have in front of you. Part of what was interesting is because in thinking about this rubric, my colleagues in Pennsylvania and I wanted to make sure that it would apply across different educational contexts. We looked at how the rubric might be important to use in CDA courses and associate degree courses and graduate courses and in bachelor's degree courses. So our hope is that this is something that you will see as a viable tool regardless of which area you teach in. So what I'd like to do next is to take a closer look at the components of the rubric and also how it was designed and how it's organized. So again, like you possibly have in front of you, this is page 1 of the rubric, and here is page 2 of the rubric. And I'd like to really take a look and focus on some of the things that I think are particularly useful about this tool and why it might be important for you to think about how you would use it. So if the rubric is something that you would think about using in your own work, which we hope you will, the first thing to do is to get familiar with the indicators and really understand what the basis of each of them is. One of the things that we're creating for Pennsylvania is a set of resources to go along with each indicator, so there will be plenty of opportunity to really understand the scope, breadth, and depth of each indicator. Now, the second step is to gather the components of the syllabus. When you talk about a course syllabus, there are several different ways of thinking about that. Often for a course, there's a syllabus that may include boilerplate information about expectations on campus. It typically will have some of the core components, but often details related to assignments or topics for discussion or rubrics are within a content management system. So one of the things that's important in terms of making sure that the use of the rubric is as accurate as possible is in gathering all of those components. And then the process is to check for explicit matches between the 20 indicators and the syllabus components. That then puts you in a position to look at the pattern, to look at what is present and what is not, and to consider enhancements or changes based on what you've learned. So let me just start with getting familiar with the indicators. And one of the things that we also would want you to think about as you looked at the indicators for a course that you're teaching is, how does each of this relate to the course? You know, it's interesting, I shared with you the emphasis on supporting children who are diverse in many ways. Traditionally, for example, it used to be that you would sometimes find information about a child who was a dual language learner in either a course on diversity or in a language and literacy course. And I think what we're looking for now is, how, as part of a curriculum course, can students consider how they would support a child who's a dual language learner? How, as part of child development, can it also be something that they're thinking about? So I think we're taking a much broader and more explicit view of how we build the opportunity to individualize into any course. Then I think one of the other things that you can take into account is, are there some of the indicators that are so important to your program that you want to make them priorities for every course in your program? So, for example, a number of the programs that I work with have identified a set of indicators. I'll show you in a minute what that looks like. Then something else that you may want to take a look at is, are there any of the indicators that do not apply to the syllabus that you're reviewing? For example, there is an indicator that is very relevant in many CDA courses that has to do with the business of a childcare program, but that's not a feature that's part of many bachelor's degree or associate degree courses. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute too. And then finally, one of the things that you might take a look at is there something that your program values so highly that you would want to add it as an indicator? And I'll show you what that looks like as well. So here is page 2 of the rubric. And this displays in a way how you might do the things that I just mentioned. So if, for example, one of the things as a program you decide is that for every course in your program, you want to make sure that the emphasis on children with disabilities, children who are diverse, children with different languages, children who have experienced trauma, if those are things that you feel so strongly about, you might decide to highlight them and make them a feature of every course if they are not now. Then you also see indicator number 17, which is the indicator on managing an effective program. Again, that's the business of serving young children. And you may decide that that is not an indicator that is relevant to your course, in which case you may shade it like I did here to indicate that it's one that you will not be marking as you go through the process of using the rubric. Finally, and actually this is an example that came from a program in Pennsylvania that I'm working with now. One of the things that they feel very strongly about is that in any course, there needs to be emphasis on both indoor and outdoor play that supports learning and development. So what you see is an unnumbered indicator that has been added for this program as a way to acknowledge their emphasis on that area of learning and development. So once again, as I mentioned, the thing to do is to gather the components. I often find when I'm reviewing syllabi from other places that I don't have access to the text. If you're reviewing someone else's syllabus and you don't, You can always go online and pull the table of contents, and it'll give you some basic information about that. But once again, these are the components that you would want to gather, and then starts the process of examining a syllabus and comparing it to the indicators on the rubric to see the extent to which there is a match, to the extent to which there are explicit alignments. So what you see here is if I were reviewing a particular syllabus and I saw that in the student learning outcomes, there was mention of emphasis on the principles of child development and learning, I would indicate with a check that that was a match that I had seen. I think you would also want to just appreciate that these are very basic components. You can see that the course description, student learning outcomes, or course objectives, and the texts are things that you often find in a typical syllabus. The course content is something that you're more likely to see in what may be a course calendar or topics for the course. And that gives you an opportunity to see whether the indicators are directly reflected as areas of emphasis in those conversations. Another important definition is at the bottom of page 1 of your handout, and that is a definition that we have been using for professional development. It's very important to this work because it clearly helps us to understand that effective professional development includes both experiences that build and promote knowledge acquisition, and also provide opportunities for students and staff to apply that knowledge by practicing. So what this means is it is not enough to read an article or watch a video, that what we really want to build in are opportunities for students to role play, to strategize about how they would support a particular child. And that is one of the features that you'll also see on the rubric, that in looking at where content is found, we want to look at both knowledge acquisition and knowledge application. On the next slide, part of what you'll notice is that there are 3 other considerations that we are always keeping in mind as part of professional development. And the first is the characteristics and context of the learners. And that's something that you have been doing effectively for a long time, thinking about whether you are supporting the learning of a group of 18-year-olds or a more mature audience, or a mixture if they have background already in early childhood and or early childhood special education. So who the learners are is always something that we want to think about. The second component is thinking about the what of professional development, or the content. And that's driven by so many different things. It can be driven by state contexts for frameworks that Pennsylvania values, can also be driven by national frameworks like the NAEYC professional standards and competencies for early childhood educators, or the DEC recommended practices. And finally, what we want to think about is how the organization and facilitation of the learning occurs. And that's something that I'm guessing many of you have experienced as one of the challenges of this past year of COVID, in that work that you may have done very effectively in face-to-face settings is now work that you're doing very effectively in virtual settings. So this is a wonderful definition to keep in mind, because it really crystallizes and reminds us of components that relate directly to the rubric and that we always need to be thinking about. So when we think about assignments, what it means that we really want to be thinking about is which of the assignments are knowledge acquisition assignments. That will be assignments that give students information. Did they learn this? Did they not? And we can achieve this through providing readings or tests, asking students to do research on a topic, to synthesize articles, to do a presentation, to summarize. Those are all examples of knowledge acquisition assignments. They learn things. Then we also want to think about knowledge application assignments, and those may involve projects, practice-based assignments, where students actually show us an example of how they would apply what they have learned, opportunities to adapt or individualize. and evidence-based approaches that show that students can, again, apply what they've learned. So what does that mean that we're looking for in the rubric? And that means that we will look at each assignment and consider whether that's an assignment at the knowledge acquisition level or at the knowledge application level. And one of the things that's important to think about is that it's usually the case that a really robust knowledge application assignment also has a component of knowledge acquisition, because we never, for example, want to ask students to design a small group activity for a group of preschool children, one of whom is a child with disabilities, or one of whom is a child who's a dual language learner, if they have not learned anything about children with disabilities or children who are dual language learners. So it's really important to consider the level at which assignments are being created and expected. So once again, what you see here are what it might look like if a program had prioritized the consistent presence in all syllabi of these 5 indicators, and what the pattern might look like about where those indicators were found. We also mentioned that there are a variety of ways to use the information to enhance syllabi. And the message is not that this is a test where you get a good or a bad grade. Instead, it's a very thoughtful way to reflect on a set of ideas and evidence, and to look for ways to make that set more explicit and more intentional. One of the things that you may also have noticed is that 3 of the indicators have to do with age, and it's often the case that a syllabus will mention in the description, this is a course about preschoolers, or this is a course that applies for preschool through grade 4. What that means then is what you would hope to see in the syllabus is a match between both that description and the kind of assignments that students have. Do they have assignments that actually apply across that age range? This becomes particularly important for programs that either have or aspire to have national accreditation, like from NAEYC, where it is a requirement of the program, of the standards and competencies, that there be emphasis on the age, the birth through age 3 range. And of course, in Pennsylvania, it's grade 4. This is a great way to complete the rubric for courses in a program, compile those, and then really see if there is evidence for how courses are covering that range. So what might you do when you have completed a rubric? One of the things that you may see is that there's an area that's not covered. So it would be a chance to discover new sources for evidence-based practice or resources. It might also be an opportunity for you to see a pattern of assignments and make a decision that you want more assignments that are explicitly knowledge application assignments, so you would make shifts in that. It may also provide an opportunity for discovering additional modules, videos, and other resources for possibly bridging the gap between what may be a very good text, but not necessarily a text that covers all of the areas of individualization that are part, for example, of developmentally appropriate practice. It's a chance to also move into some of the newer areas of emphasis on equity, on building resilience. And I think it's also something that's part of ongoing professional development for faculty members and instructors, that it may be a chance for you to acquire new information, new examples that you can share with your students. All the bullets that you see on this slide will be part of the second webinar that will be held next week, to talk about what are ways to enhance what is going on in a particular course based on using the rubric. So let me move now to what's on pages 3 and 4 of the brief guide to using the rubric. Much of what I've said is delineated there with additional examples about how you might use the rubric. And then there is a 2-page syllabus where you have an opportunity to try out the rubric on a sample course. So let me just give you an example. And one of the things that you'll see in that sample rubric is the assignment that appears on the screen right now. That's an assignment that requires students to read 10 professional journal articles related to infant growth and development, and then to write a paragraph summarizing the key points of each of those articles. So based on what we've been talking about in the Pennsylvania rubric, would you think for a minute about whether you think this is a knowledge acquisition assignment or a knowledge application assignment, or both? And drop your answer in the chat box now, if you would please do that for me. Let's see what happens. Give you a minute. I am so pleased that you appreciate that this is a straight up knowledge acquisition assignment. You're absolutely right. And so one of the ways that you can use this sample is to really get familiar with the rubric, try it out on a course that's not yours. And let's just kind of think for a minute about some of the things that are important to consider as you are using the rubric. So words that I find myself using consistently when I am working with a group of faculty members using a rubric are the words explicit and intentional. One of the reasons that I think it's wisest for someone else to review your syllabus and you to review theirs is because often if we review our own, we may not see the words that tell us that we included emphasis on inclusion in children with disabilities, but we remember that we always talk about that in week 4 of the course. That's not explicit. So someone else reviewing that would pick up on that, and it might be a chance for you to maybe make that one of the topics that you would include in the calendar, really to signal to your students the importance of that topic, or that they'll be expected to apply that content. I also always go through the components of a syllabus visually and electronically. I do a visual scan, and I also keyword search using the words of each of the indicators. And that way I miss things every single time. I think that can then be helpful in making sure that you do not undervalue what's there. I make notes if I notice, for example, that there's emphasis in assignment 4 on a particular indicator. I'll write assignment 4. So if I were to go back and look again, it would clue me as to where to look. And then finally, I think, as I mentioned, it's really helpful to ask a colleague to review your syllabus for you. What's coming is a number of exciting resources from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to support your work in being outstanding instructors and faculty members. And this includes short sets of resources, long sets of resources, a website that will be a wonderful resource for you. And then on February 9th, as I mentioned, will be part 2 of what we started today. And that will be a chance to really dive into deeper examples of how to use the Pennsylvania rubric to support enhancements, on how to shift assignments from knowledge acquisition to knowledge application, how to actually also build in an explicit emphasis on some of the areas that you may decide you want to enhance within a particular course. So what will happen next is I wanted to show you one last slide, and then I wanted to remind you of where you can find all the materials for today's webinar. When this section of the webinar is over, please feel free to ask questions and we will discuss in greater depth your ideas about the rubric. So last slide is a reminder that all of the resources from the webinar, all the things that you were able to download as handouts, including the PowerPoints, are available at this new website for you to use on an ongoing basis, to share with other faculty colleagues, and to draw upon. There will be more resources in this section of the website coming over time.